All right, this is study 17 of our study in Galatians, and today we're going to finish chapter 4. We're going to look at verse 21 to 31. And before we do, we'll answer the questions from verse 12 to verse 20. So question 1 was about Paul's plea. He pleaded with the Galatian believers to come back into the freedom of being heirs of the promise, instead of going into the bondage of the law. He, as a Jewish believer, was now redeemed from the law, and so he was living as a Gentile, as you see in chapter 2, verse 14. And he's essentially saying, I became like you, free from the law, and I'm appealing to you to become like me, free from the law, free in Christ, heirs of the promise. Go and read 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 23 for more about that. Question 2 then, when Paul first came to Galatia to preach the gospel, he had an illness, and at the time he needed care. But the Galatians treated him with love and with compassion. They welcomed him in, and they listened to the message he had, the message of the gospel. And in those days, a really beautiful relationship was formed between Paul and the Galatians. Question 3 then, Paul sees the Judaisers almost like a flattering charmer, seeking to court and lure the Galatian believers away from the truth. And then once they were away and they were isolated from the true gospel, the Galatian believers would be dependent upon the Judaisers. Their motivation then was twisted and self-seeking. There's more about that in chapter 1 verse 10, in Philippians chapter 3 verse 2 and verse 18 to 19, and Romans chapter 16 verse 17 to 18. So the Judaisers were luring them away, flatterers and charmers. But question 4, Paul seen himself as a loving parent. A parent who was watching these children of his being lured away from the truth and lured into slavery. He explains that the pain he has for them right now is like giving birth to them all over again. His desire is not selfish. He wants them to live as heirs of the promise, with the Spirit at work in their lives, forming them into the image of Christ more and more, which is what Galatians has been all about, that it's by faith we are declared righteous, it's by faith we receive the Spirit, and it's the Spirit who forms Christ in us, it's not the law. Go also and read Romans chapter 8, verse 29. So now we're in chapter 4, verse 21 to 31. Paul has argued in chapter 3 that Abraham was declared righteous by faith and received a promise that through his descendant the nations would experience that same blessing, the blessing of being made righteous by faith. He's also argued that the law was a temporary guardian over the Jewish people until Jesus, the promised descendant, came. And now he's come, the guardian is no longer needed. Now he's going to use a final argument here. He's going to use what we call an allegorical one. Here he's going to explain once more what the relationship between the law and the promise is. It would be worth reading, if you have the chance, Genesis 16, verse 1 to 16, and Genesis 21, verse 9 to 21. It's really going to help you with the context of what's being said here. Also, chapter 4, verse 27 is a quote from Isaiah 54, verse 1. So there's 3 questions for this section. And again, this is a slightly tricky section of Galatians, but it's really just an allegory, and it's quite smooth. It's just going to take a little bit of mental work to get there. So question 1, who are the 2 mothers, and what do they both symbolize here in Galatians 4? You'll see that in verse 22 and in verse 24 to 27. Question 2, who are the 2 sons, and what do they both symbolize? You see that in chapter 4, verse 23 to 26 and verse 28. And in question 3, what is the relationship between the 2 sons and the 2 mothers? Verse 29 to verse 30. God bless.